Good evening, everyone. So, I welcome all of you joined here today, all the distinguished speakers, moderator, professionals, academics, students, and everyone who have joined with the national webinar series entitled Climate Smart Sri Lanka. So, today marks the first of 11 informative webinars that SLTC is holding under the series that bring both national and also international experts together to keep an informed audience, or rather, an informed nation, as Sri Lanka is still recovering from the unprecedented natural disaster we experienced last December, the cyclone Ditwa. So, this webinar series is organized by Sri Lanka Technology Campus under the guidance of the Vice Chancellor, Professor Chandrika Vijayaratne, in collaboration with the Institute of Environmental Professionals of Sri Lanka. And as a professional and a responsible higher education institute recognized by the Ministry of Education, and as a member of Sri Lanka Association of Non-State Higher Education Institutes and the Association of Commonwealth Universities, we at SRTC are constantly committed towards advancing climate resilience and also thereby promoting sustainable development. So IEPSL, which is the joint strategic partner, the Institute of Environmental Professionals Sri Lanka, is also an equally responsible professional body that practices environmental professionals in Sri Lanka, and it also plays an integral role in upholding professional standards with the expertise and the services that they do for the benefit of the entire nation and also for the wider public. So, with that, we can now start the first webinar titled today, which is Healing After the Storm, Understanding Trauma, Stress, and Community Recovery. And at a time where all the livelihoods of Sri Lanka and the infrastructure is affected by the unfortunate natural disaster, the cyclone Ditwa, this webinar would look at the pathway as to how Sri Lanka as a community can build up a stronger community recovery. So, prior to starting the session, I would like to respectfully request all of you to keep your microphones muted at all times to ensure that this webinar is conducted in a smooth manner. And also, we will be opening up a space for the Q&A after each guest talk. And by the time, you can also send all your questions through the chat box, and we are happy to accommodate all the questions while the session is going. And if any one of you hasn't still registered for the webinar, please register through the link that you can see in the chat box. And also at the end of the session, we will separately be showing you a feedback form where you will have to fill, and that will be used to issue the e-certificates for you. And since we are going to present it at the end of the session, I encourage all of you to stay until the end of the session for you to scan the QR code where you would get directed to the feedback form, and you can fill it so that your e-certificates will be sent to you in the due course. And also, I must say that this session is being recorded for educational purposes, and this will be visible across our YouTube platform and the social media platforms for educational and awareness reasons. So, talking about the guest speakers today, we are glad to have two guest speakers, Dr. Santhushi Amarasuriya, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Colombo, and also Dr. Jeevani Herath, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Colombo. And the session will be moderated by Ms. Ishani Kariyawasam, who is acting as the General Manager of Academic Administration at CIRP. So I would officially hand the session over to Ms. Ishani Kariyawasam to carry out the formal proceedings after this formal introduction of her. Ms. Ishani Kariyawasam, who is the moderator for today's webinar, is an accomplished applied psychologist, academic leader, an educator with over a decade of experience across higher education, teacher education, and mental health practice in Sri Lanka and the Maldives. She currently serves as a General Manager, Academic Administration at the Colombo Institute of Research and Psychology, where she provides strategic leadership in academic governance, quality assurance, and program development. She has held senior academic roles, including Deputy Dean, Department Head, Senior Lecturer, and Program Coordinator. And she has also collaborated with internationally recognized universities in the UK and Australia. Her expertise spans curriculum design, teaching excellence, research supervision, corporate training, and well-being interventions, complemented by hands-on clinical experience as a mental health counselor. Passionate about psychology-driven education, research, and well-being, Ms. Ishani is deeply committed to empowering students, educators, and organizations to thrive academically, professionally, and personally. So with that, I would now like to invite Ms. Ishani Kariyawasam to lead the session today, which is Healing After the Storm, Understanding Trauma, Stress, and Community Recovery. Ms. Ishani, over to you.
Thank you, Mangana, for that generous introduction. And good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you joining us live from across Sri Lanka. Hello, I'm Ishani Kariyawasam, as Mangana just mentioned, and it's my sincere pleasure to be your moderator for this virtual conversation tonight. We are here for the inaugural session of Climate Smart Sri Lanka, Awareness to Action, a crucial series brought to you by SLTC Research University and the Institute of Environmental Professionals Sri Lanka. So, while we often focus on the visible damage after disaster, this session, Healing After the Storm, Understanding Trauma, Stress and Community Recovery, turns our attention to what remains unseen, the emotional and psychological wounds. Our goal is to bridge the gap from awareness to actionable healing. We are incredibly fortunate to have two exceptional thought leaders with us tonight to guide this discussion. First, join me in welcoming Dr. Santhushi Amarasuriya. Dr. Amarasuriya is a senior lecturer at the Department of Medical Humanities, Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo. Joining the university in 2006, she recently completed her term as head of the Department of Medical Humanities. She's a clinical psychologist by profession and also has a PhD from the University of Melbourne. Dr. Amarasuriya, a warm welcome to you. We are so glad to have you with us today. Our second speaker is Dr. Jeevani Herath. Dr. Jeevani Herath is a senior lecturer and head of the Department of Social Science Education, again at the Faculty of Education, University of Colombo, and Deputy Director of the Center for Mediation Research, University of Colombo. She has expertise in gender studies, primary education, human rights education, and mediation research. Dr. Herath is actively involved in teaching, research, and academic leadership, contributing to educational policy and practice through her work within Sri Lanka and internationally. Dr. Herath, thank you for joining with us this evening. So with that, let's move straight into our first presentation by Dr. Amarasuriya. Dr. Amarasuriya, the floor is all yours for the next 40 minutes.
Thank you, Ishani. Let me first share my presentation with you. All right. Okay, so at the very outset, I think I must commend the Sri Lanka Technology Campus for this very, very forward-thinking effort, because unfortunately, climate change is something that is a sad reality. We are experiencing very extreme weather events. And if you consider the past, our past, our preparation or response, it was more a sort of responsiveness to disaster that we have been sort of used to. However, as we understand, this climate change is something that is very much a reality. It's something that is going to be very much a part of our story, and being climate smart and actually integrating efforts or actions to respond better to these disasters, climate related disasters, is extremely important. So my job today is to think about this from a very psychological perspective. Now, if you think about being climate smart, it is about building infrastructure, building systems to respond better to climate-related events. If you think about the systems, those systems consist of individuals who are often rational and sometimes irrational. I would say often it might be the reverse. So it is important really to understand what drives these humans in these situations. So the approach I'm going to take, so the title of my presentation, the way I've titled it is Psychologically Smart Responding. And what I'm going to do is to take us through a conversation of how you might respond in relation to the disaster cycle. So if you were to read some papers, you would find that the stages of a disaster are mapped out in different ways. But just for the ease of presentation, I'm going to think about it in three broad stages, really: disaster preparation, disaster response, and disaster recovery. However, if you are talking about being climate smart, we have to start at the very beginning. And the very beginning is to try and really prevent some of these occurrences, or at least reduce the impact of some of these occurrences. So, as I said, I will take you through all these steps to think about how human beings respond and how human beings might somewhat, in some instances, seem a little irrational. Why might they do this? Because from that, we understand how we can then respond more smartly and how we can engage these individuals into more climate smart actions. So let's start from the very beginning, as I said. So we are beginning with disaster prevention. Now, as we know, some of these disasters probably are locked in. So although we act, perhaps it could be too late, but there are certain things that we might be able to minimize. So it is about trying to reduce these occurrences into the future. So a very, very important, interesting, intriguing question would be, why do some people still deny climate change? Um, Climate change, these discussions have occurred for many, many years. But you know that even among scholars, there have been debates as to whether this, in fact, is a true fear that we need to have. But now we see all these changes occurring, and we do know that it is becoming reality. But why might people deny climate change? So let's try to think about this from a very psychological perspective. As I said, these conversations have been going on for a long time. We've talked about changes in the global temperature. We've been talking about, raising the sea levels, but these might have seemed a little far, temporally far. So these were into the future, and these were abstract events that sometimes people felt like, this might happen, this might not happen, and it felt very distant to people. Other factor could be that, what you call the availability heuristic. Sometimes things have not happened before, so it might not happen now. So the classic example for us might be the tsunami. None of us really knew much about, or many did not know about what a tsunami was and how you might react to it. And because of that, even with some of the warnings, there might not have been enough reaction. Now, this is not that was just prior to the event, even prior to the event. I'm actually talking about prevention here, but I'm using the tsunami as an example. So when you are not very familiar with what this might be, you might think, no, life is not going to change much. And also we have this thing called the normalcy bias. So even if these extreme weather events were to happen, life might just go on. So all these rising temperatures that people are talking about, perhaps we'll just survive, and things will go on. And in fact, this is a very, very adaptive, psychologically adaptive way of responding to the world, because if not, it is all doom and gloom, and there will be a lot of psychological dysfunction. So these defense mechanisms are necessary for us. But in these kinds of instances where reaction is necessary, it does become a problem. The other thing that might be an issue is diffusion of responsibility. So climate change is a huge topic, something huge. The area is so vast, and everybody must react. And if people are not reacting, you feel like, why must I? And of course, a conversation that is very important here is that the perceived costs of change might outweigh benefits. So we're talking about the multinationals, fossil fuel vendors, the actually acceptance of climate change as a reality leads to a loss of a lot. And that loss, would they perceive it as being worthwhile? So these are some of the factors that might prevent um, people from engaging in preventative action. So the insights that we can draw from this is that education clearly, and realizing that climate change is in fact a reality, and the fact that action against that climate change might change circumstances and outcomes is very important. And now we know that some of this is happening. We know that in schools, these conversations have started up. But there has to be far more conversation about it to understand that this needs to really change, that it is a very serious threat. And as I mentioned before, when you think it is abstract, you might not respond. But when you give concrete examples, locally relevant examples, experiences, people become a little more reactive. Human beings also tend to be rather egocentric. So when examples are cited in relation to themselves, their loved ones, for example, you can say that the changes in the temperature now prevent you from letting your children go out and play. Now that was not a reality for me when I was a child. That the temperatures were not so high, but now you can't. You think twice before putting your child out to play in the sun. So things like that really worry you, and then you realize that these things need to change, and then you understand that you do have certain responsibility to respond and to react. The other thing that is important is to have repeated and trusted persons giving you the same message, and having many messengers saying the same thing. So we cannot have climate change deniers also within the conversation. Everybody consistently needs to transmit the same message, and also used shared language. So sometimes policies have been established in this country. However, that needs to translate into lay language, lay action. What can I do to prevent things? And also, as I said, this sense of diffusion of responsibility needs to go away, and we need to understand that there is something I can do to change these circumstances. We also know that action can be very infectious. You would note that now, often if you go to an event, people are very conscious about not using plastics, and you see this across the board now. And that is, you see things happening, you see people change, you see people making an effort, and those changes can be very, very infectious. But when doing this, we must also acknowledge that, as I mentioned earlier, certain climate changes may be locked in. So when you give the responsibility to individuals, you must also understand that this responsibility needs to be realistic responsibility. Warning has to be coupled with doable actions, because there are certain things we might not be able to change. So what can we change? Because the sort of the bad side of the bad effects of this would be that people feel that they are so responsible, and feel very, very distressed when change does not occur. So within our sort of what can we change is what we need to discuss. And it is about really a shared story, and it is not an individual burden. And as I mentioned earlier, many messengers saying the same thing. So cross sector collaboration, local governance, health, education, and environment. So that is really prevention. So our story begins in terms of climate smart actions at the very beginning. You try to prevent or minimize climate change. However, as I said earlier, climate change is a reality, and associated with that might be certain disasters that we need to contend with. So the next step that we can think of is disaster preparation. So when we think about disaster preparation, we're thinking about certain actions that one might be able to take to minimize the effects of certain disasters. So it is anticipating a disaster, planning for it, and reducing the risks that might occur. The challenges of this might be that there is actually underestimation of risk, delayed action, and resistance to behavior change. So let's translate this once again into a question. Why do people sometimes ignore disaster warnings? We saw that with Ditwa. We saw people going out despite the repeated warnings that were given. And in fact, this led to a lot of frustration of, the public who were viewing this, and even more frustration when people who went out then had to rescue operations had to be initiated, and that led to a lot of investment of resources, and sort of criticizing of those individuals. But why might this occur? So let's once again understand these occurrences. So often, so one aspect is risk perception and behavioral decision making. So as human beings, we tend to respond more to what we perceive as threatening than actual objective probability of something occurring. So we think it is dangerous. Maybe it's not dangerous, but we might respond to it, and the reverse of that. So perceived threat might not be high, and hence people might not respond. Also, when things are very familiar, you might respond better than when things are unfamiliar, and it could happen in the reverse as well. And also, people think that, bad things will not happen to me. That's an optimism bias. And also, I mentioned this normalcy bias earlier. And in addition to this, past experiences where you react and nothing happens. So that crying wolf effect. So you feel that it's no point, because this is once again a false alarm. So your risk perception might dictate whether you act. The other thing is communication and trust in communication. So if the messages that are being transmitted are unclear, we notice that in certain instances, messages transmitted were a little too late. There might be inaction. Obviously, there might be inaction. Also, distrust in authorities. If you have several people giving you mixed messages, you really don't know what to do in these instances. And also, this leads to actually a cognitive overload, because then you need to decide whether not to react. So this could be another reason that might lead to inaction. We also need to consider the more practical aspects of this. People might be warned to evacuate, but there might be practical circumstances that we need to also consider. Poverty, responsibilities that they have. They might have elderly at home, they might have children that they need to take care of, and moving is too much of a hassle. Or perhaps the messages that are being given to you are messages that people cannot comprehend, and hence they might not respond. Also, this issue of protection of the status quo. So we know that often people are afraid to abandon their properties because of a fear of looting. They feel so. It is really a cost benefit analysis. The cost of evacuating feels much greater than actually staying behind and protecting your property. And people are attached to their homes. They do not, even if they think something's going to happen, they don't just want to run away. They, all their possessions are there, and they would want to try to protect what they call, it's not a house, it is their home. They want to protect their home and try to minimize damage. So in those instances, the decision making might be flawed, but it is very driven by human motivation. And of course, there could be inertia. Sometimes people say, "Oh, I mean, my fate. I will go when I need to, when I have to go, and not react." And also the social referencing effect. So, if I take my mind back to Ditwa and what we were experiencing. So I was in Colombo, um, and if you just looked around, people were going about their activities as every day. There was the trees were swaying back and forth, and there was clearly something that was happening. But everyone just went about with what they were doing, and because of that, you also develop this sense of inertia, thinking nothing bad might happen. Okay, so let's try to draw from that understanding and think about some of the actions that we might take in terms of prevention. So, risk assessment is important. We know that um, we might not be able to predict all disasters that occur, obviously, but we might be able to predict uh, certain groups which might be at risk. So, for example, people on the coastline, or people in low-lying areas, or people who might be at risk of landslides. So assessing that risk and really clearly communicating this risk to people. Sometimes people are not in a position to go and find a better place to settle in, so they have to stay there. However, they can be educated as to what the risk is that they are in and what they might need to do. And also in these instances, it's always important to calibrate these messages according to the receptivity. Sometimes people might not understand the message that is being given. They might not understand the risk. The perceived threat might not be high, and hence they might not respond. So, how do you clearly communicate? And also, if this were to happen, how do you react? In an instance of a disaster, there is a stress response, and your thinking faculties are compromised. There's a cognitive overload. In those instances, you really don't know how to act. So drills, we know that in officers you do the fire drills, and you are trained as to how to respond. Similarly, in disasters, what do you do? How do you react? So you give a mental framework or a schema for action or evacuation routes, and even things like emergency bags. If something were to happen, you need to ensure, might need to ensure that their valuable possessions are stored away. So what do they need to do prior to this? So helping people think through, because they might not be able to imagine what might happen or what things might look like in these instances. As I said, the normalcy bias is there. Things, they might think that things will go on the same way. However, there might be a disaster. So you need to take people through that narrative to understand how to respond. And of course, the increase in community participation and increase in ownership of these actions. Also, always transmitting clear messages. I've said this many times already. They need to be clear, they need to be unambiguous, and people need to know when to act. So, for example, a green or amber or red warning, what does it mean? Is it common sense to everyone? Uh, when should somebody evacuate? At what point? Sometimes these very simple things people might not understand, because we must understand that we are dealing with people at different levels of understanding. Also, action oriented versus fear based. Fear disables you, because there is a very high level of emotional dysregulation that will occur. So instead of a fear based reaction, instead of scaring somebody, you tell them what they can do. And always you need to have communication authorities. One of the defining features of a disaster is it is out of your control. And losing control is something very hard for a human being. So somebody has to take control. Somebody has to tell you what you might do. Somebody needs to re-establish that sense of certainty that you had before. So we need to identify communication authorities. Who is it that needs to transmit this message? You can't have several people saying different messages. And once there is a communication authority, there needs to be coordination amongst the communication leaders. So for different people, they look up to different individuals. So it might be a healthcare worker, it might be a teacher, it might be a religious leader. All of these individuals are very responsible. If one group says no, it is no more fatalism, it's my fate, and I things will happen the way it's supposed to happen, whereas the communication authorities are telling you no, you need to evacuate. So there is a mismatch, and people might not respond. So people must understand that in their role, they might have personal opinions, but in the role you take, you need to also align with the communication, or the message that we want to transmit. Okay, so we talked about prevention. Now let's talk about the disaster response per se. When you talk about a disaster, there's actually a collective trauma. Large segments of the population might be affected. However, they might be affected at different levels. So there'll be those primarily affected, those are who are directly exposed, those who have a secondary effect. So let's say family of those who have been directly exposed, or those who have had to face certain circumstances because of a disaster. So for example, somebody who has not been affected directly, however, somebody whose transport modes have got compromised, or who cannot now travel through a certain area, and because of that they are affected. So that's secondary affected. And then tertiary affected, those who just are watching what is happening. And cutting across those levels would be the first responders and relief workers, who might be primarily affected, who might have family, or who might also be witnessing things as they go on. Now, if you think about the damage that might occur due to disaster, there might be a linear effect. You might think that those who were primarily affected might have greater effect. However, if you think about the mental health impact, it might not be a linear relationship, because it might not be those who have been primarily affected who might respond or react. It might be somebody who was just witnessing what occurred and had a severe mental health response. And one reason could be why different people might respond to different ways in relation to different types of exposure might be certain vulnerabilities that they are in. So there are certain groups that we would identify as vulnerable groups. So children and adolescents. So children might not be cognitively advanced enough to understand what is happening. Adolescents are in certain developmental stages. They go through existential crisis. What is the meaning of life? And then something like this happens. So they might be vulnerable. Women who are single, or pregnant or widowed, the elderly who might have prior mental health conditions and who are dependent, those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, those who have already gone through major life stresses, who are already stressed and then face this, ethnic minorities, and those who have pre-existing physical disabilities or mental health disabilities. So we might see differences in responses due to some of these individuals belonging to these groups. So let's first discuss the reactions of those who might have been affected, or who are primary affected persons. So if you just see what's on my slide there, you see a whole range of responses, from emotional responses to cognitive responses to physical and behavioral responses. And you would think that a mental health worker working with disaster affected victims has a lot to deal with. But let's try to understand these responses that these individuals might have. So from an objective analysis, if you think about the impact of disaster, these individuals might have experienced loss. It might have been death, missing persons, loss of their homes, possessions. They might have been exposed to rescue operations, bodies. They might be displaced. Everything around them might have got disrupted. There could be people who are disconnected. They cannot speak to their loved ones. They don't know where they are. And with all that comes a lot of exhaustion. And also, people might have also got involved in rescue operations, and they might have contracted certain illnesses, or because of the circumstances, unhygienic food, or water that basically unclean water consumption might lead to certain illnesses. So they experience quite a lot of impact. So the cycle, if you think about this from a psychological perspective, how all this might impact the person, there is a overwhelming of coping capacities. When somebody faces a disaster, there is an acute stress reaction. Now, many of you would know that we define stress as something, there is a threatening event, you perceive it to be threatening, and you perceive your coping resources to not be adequate to deal with this threatening event. So it's a lot about your perception. So that is why we see that some people get stressed for things when others don't. Now, if you think about a disaster situation, you might perceive it as stressful, and in reality, also, it is very stressful. And if you think about your coping resources, you will perceive your coping resources to be depleted. And in fact, they might be depleted internally and externally. So it is an overwhelming response that these individuals face. And hence, they might have all these reactions. So there's a disruption of psychological functioning. There's also this shattering of core assumptions. For human beings, we need to feel safe. We need to know things are predictable. We want to believe. That's a completely different conversation, but we want to believe that we can control our outcomes, and we want certainty. But disaster takes all that away from you, and then there is this shattering of your core assumptions. There's a threat to meaning. Suddenly your identity has gone. You've lost people around you, what you were. You've lost your job, your roles are no longer there. And we know that certain villages got wiped out. Your collective narrative goes away. So there is a threat to meaning, your identity, and your relationships. There's also a loss of dignity. You are now suddenly carted into a shelter, and you're told to go there. You're told to not go back to your home. You lose the privacy. Maybe you were living in a very, very impoverished area, but still, that was your home, and suddenly you lose all that, and you're now told to stay and not visit what you call your home. There's lack of structure, there's lack of routine, because things have got so disrupted, and there is a breakdown in social networks. And of course, in certain instances, some individuals might have a survivor guilt. Their family members, some might have been more affected. They were also affected, but less affected. Maybe their actions, they could have acted differently, and outcomes might have been different. So they're going through a lot. So now, when I project this again to you, all these responses seem very normal, and that is what we do need to acknowledge. All these responses, although they seem a lot, are very, very normal reactions to an abnormal situation. So for an individual who has been affected by disaster, the most important thing is to re-establish their normal functioning. You start with basic needs, your safety needs, and stabilization, because by doing that, you are helping the person to get back to normalcy. And also, when you are stressed, I mentioned this earlier, there is cognitively, you can't think, you can't decision make, you can't problem solve. So when giving instructions, they need to be very simple. You need to repeat messages so people know what to do, because sometimes they just can't decide. And you might have heard this word before. Psychological first aid is something that people need to understand how to deliver. So we saw lots of volunteers going in, and psychological first aid is not giving mental health assistance, but it's just merely giving psychological support. Very briefly, it consists of three arms. You observe, you look, you listen, and you link. So if somebody is having a problem, you link that person with the appropriate individual, so that their needs can be met and you move towards re-establishing normal functioning. Now we know that in the Ditwa disaster, we found that there were lots of volunteers going in because they wanted to help, and it was wonderful to see the humanitarian efforts that were present. However, even volunteer need a lot of training, because it might be a well-meaning thing you say, but that might be the worst thing to tell somebody who has been affected by disaster. So you could say, things could have been far worse for you. That might not be very helpful. Or somebody might ask, why didn't you react faster? It might be just a question, an inquisitive question, and not asked in a way to make the person feel bad, but that can have a very negative consequence. So volunteers that go in must have some basic level of training, because they need to respond appropriately, and this is just psychological first aid. Mental health support has to be given by people who have been trained and who are equipped to provide that support. Also maintaining dignity of individuals. So people might be in the shelters, they need their privacy, perhaps they were not in good circumstances before, so you can't just disregard that. Still they need their privacy, they need to feel human again, because it's a very dehumanizing experience what they've just been through. So that needs to set back in. And also hope needs to be very realistic. Some people, we noticed, or we observed that people were getting very distressed. Sometimes they were promised help, and when they did not receive it, they were not happy. So when we foster hope, it needs to be very realistic, so that people don't feel very disillusioned at the end. Sorry. And also, of course, we need to pay attention to the vulnerable groups that I highlighted earlier. Okay, so just let me see the time. Right, so let me go through this section a little quicker. So secondary if affected persons would be, as I mentioned, people family members and those who have been indirectly exposed to a disaster situation. So caregiver burden, role strain, and also lack of agency. Sometimes you are way away from the disaster and you can't help the person within the disaster. You cannot communicate. We saw this happening with many people. They were, safe in Colombo and their family was somewhere else. And there was a communication blackout, and they felt utterly helpless and hopeless because, you can't respond. Disruptions, these people, I mentioned the disruptions earlier, and of course, disconnection. So once again, clear messages, supporting host communities, and also systematic responding of the system. So let's say, for example, somebody's travel has got affected because of the disaster experience. So there has to be, the system needs to know how to respond. So should all schools be closed? Should workplaces be closed? Should they be excused? The system has to respond in a similar way, because you might have certain schools closed, but in that area, some institutions are, going on. So it creates a lot of tension for human beings. So it has to be sort of a common response, and everybody decides in relation to the magnitude of the effect of the disaster. Tertiary affected people, as I said, are observers, those who witness the situation. So vicarious traumatization, repeated exposure to disturbing events. We saw so many disturbing visuals on the TVs, on social media, and these are repeated. So people just watching it felt very helpless and felt like, very distressed. And sometimes they identified, over identified, and that could lead to a lot of anxiety. And also, there could be this overwhelming need to do something. Compassion, sympathy, that's all very good, but when you feel that you don't know what to do, that can also make you feel very anxious and feel very very distressed about yourself. So how do you channel these efforts, and how do you respond to this? So responsible reporting, the visuals that we see, the visuals that are shared need to be uh, managed in a certain way. Now, you saw so many distressing things. Children were walking about, watching what was going on. They might not make sense. Radio, TV channels need to decide what level of visuals are appropriate for a wide range of audiences, because this could also lead to vicarious traumatization. Clear, consistent messaging and coordination of support. So, as I mentioned, people want to help others, but we saw that sometimes even the poorest person was making little meals and going and giving collection points. However, we also saw that some of these things were going waste because the efforts were not coordinated. So people need to know, where can I help, what can I do, and let's do it together. So a lot of coordination. Relief workers uh, engage in very heroic actions in these situations, but although they are trained, highly trained, they might not be trained enough for a situation like that. How do you deal with such situations? And they might be vicariously traumatized, they might burn out, and there could be a role conflict. They could be also affected by the disaster. They might be a primary affected individual, but they are also a relief worker. So there is a role conflict. And seeing these things over and over again might lead to compassion fatigue and numbness. So training is a must. Understanding that they need rest, they need rotation, realistic workloads, validation and recognition, and guidelines as to how to respond. Sometimes you need to make very difficult decisions. So guidance as to how to do it, because there could be moral dilemmas that these individuals face. And also um, to be able to speak about your experiences, just to ventilate, can be very very important for these individuals or this group of individuals who deal with a lot of sadness, a lot of loss, and a lot of human suffering. Okay, so I moved on to my last section now. Let's talk about disaster recovery. Um, so the question I pose is, why do some people take longer to recover? Uh, Many people, although initially they respond with all those reactions that I showed to you earlier, those they stabilize and things become normal again and they start functioning. But there could be certain individuals who have delayed reactions or who might go into also developing even mental health disorders, from depression to anxiety to post-traumatic stress disorder to substance related disorders. So there might be a certain segment that might face these consequences as well. So there might be certain moderators of this. So I mentioned earlier, there are definitely vulnerable groups, but also individuals who have not been supported in a timely manner, where the quality of support has not been okay, where the social connectedness has got compromised, where perceived fairness and transparency of aid has been absent, or their meaning making narratives have been absent, could find it harder to deal with these situations, and they might have uh, a, a longer duration of dealing with these difficulties that they might have faced. But all in all, you will find many recovering once they have got reestablished. So, the psychological insights in relation to recovery would be there could be difficulties in recovery, reconstruction, and reintegration. What is important is to reestablish safety, identity, and meaning. We also need to be aware that repeated disasters can create chronic fear and helplessness. And also, certain groups, I've talked about vulnerable groups. Here, the youth also might have climate anxiety. So, what are the insights that we can draw from this? So, we understand integration is important. You can't have people in camps forever and ever. They need to go back as soon as possible. So they need to go back to their schools, the children, back to work. But when we tell them to go back to work, what is waiting for them at the other end? Is it a school that they can now go back to? Can they travel to school? Practically, although we say we need to reestablish, we need to get back to normalcy, what does it take to establish that normalcy? So that needs to be assessed, and you need to understand whether people can reintegrate easily. Also, you help people or give people a space for storytelling and mourning. This occurred in many of the camps, just their narratives, because the narratives have changed, so they need to go through that in their minds to integrate this into their story, and also supporting in identity reconstruction. The other important thing is participatory rebuilding. Everybody needs to be a part of this rebuilding and recovery process, because sometimes after a while people might start having this learned helplessness. You can't keep doing things for somebody affected. We know this. Initially, yes, because they have been affected, but after a while, they need to get back on their feet. So even in the camps, you would see that a lot of these people are doing things. So they are also working to help others deal with the issues, because learned helplessness can be very, very harmful for these individuals because they cannot go back into the previous lives they were. Uh, Being equity focused is important. I mentioned this factor of realistic hope, and of course, cross sector collaboration. Now, what I just shared with you in the last few minutes is a very academic standpoint, sharing with you some psychological insights. But doing all this is not very easy, because there is a lot of effort, there is a lot of coordination in these efforts for rebuilding and reconstruction. So there has to be a lot of cross-sector collaboration, from local governance to health to education to environment, to make these a reality. So with that, I think I will conclude. So this is a story, or this is something that we need to work together to rebuild, to make our nation a climate smart, uh, more climate smart one. Okay, thank you very much.
Right. Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Amarasuriya. That was profoundly insightful and grounding. And you have given us the essential framework for understanding trauma's footprint on a community. So now we move into the Q&A segment of this session. Thank you all participants who have already shared their questions in the chat box. So while participants continue to post their questions, I'd like to begin with a question that often arises in post-disaster context. So Dr. Amarasuriya, in communities, when affected by climate-related disasters, many individuals feel that their emotional reactions are a sign of weakness. So, how can we help normalize trauma responses while still encouraging recovery and resilience? I would like you to
Yes,
answer that
yeah.
question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So that is a very important point that you are highlighting, which, so these reactions, and as I said, if you saw that slide that I shared, it's almost overwhelming for somebody who goes onto the field to think that they need to deal with all this. However, these are all normal reactions. There is a very sort of clear psychological basis to as to why people are reacting like that. So it is important that message of this is normal. What you faced was abnormal. Disaster is an abnormal situation. Maybe it has become a reality, but it is abnormal. So the way you're responding is extremely normal. And people need to understand this, and people need to understand that, things will get better. Once again, I did mention you need to give realistic hope, but let's talk about this. Let's work together and reestablish things for you. So psychological first aid, as I mentioned earlier, can be something important. So it's about just kind, compassionate individuals talking to another human being. So that human connection is also important in these instances. So you look, you listen, and you link. And most of the time, people get better as they are reintegrated and as once normal functioning is reestablished.
I'm on mute, right? Okay. All right. Also, I just picked this question from one of our participants, Doctor. So I think we need to give an answer for this. So the question is, recent Ditwa cyclone disaster. During the disaster, some of my friends suffer heavy losses and they were mentally down during this period. So the question is, what kind of things can we do to relieve them?
Right. So, they could be, when you say down, could be for many reasons. It could be because you saw the suffering that people went through. It could be because you suddenly realize that life is not so predictable, life is out of control. But as I mentioned earlier, I think it links up into my previous response as well. We do react like this. However, we do need to, understand that we will feel like this, but things will get better for us. And how you might make a person feel better is people have unique coping responses. So, is it talking to other people, or is it thinking about this challenge, or doing something, going out and helping? Different things work for different people, and as you do that, you can deal with these stress responses that you have. I hope I answered that question, but
Yes,
it could be
I think.
different. Yeah, it could be different factors that might lead to this feeling of, you're really down. It could, it's just maybe I'm not doing anything. I'm feeling down. So it's the conversation is important, and you do need to recognize that, as I said, vicarious traumatization is also something very real. People witness this. I think we were all overwhelmed with what we saw, and so you will feel like this.
Yeah, so I think with in answering something like that, I think the question is very personal. So the recovery, the healing, is also based on one's resilience and a lot of other factors, as you rightly mentioned, Doctor. So we have another question that I picked from one of our participants. So he or she says that it's not just Ditwa, but Sri Lanka has faced repeated climatic related disasters, and also he specifically said, I just did caused direct economic damage and affected over 200,000 households. So the questions are, um, uh, how can we ensure whatever the programs that we conduct, that they reach towards the most vulnerable population, including women, children, and rural communities? That is the first one. That is one question. The other question that he wants to know, what evidence-based strategies can integrate psychosocial support into this disaster recovery? So there are two questions. So let's take one at a time.
All right. With regard to accessing the more vulnerable communities, it is extremely important because we know even in Ditwa, aid didn't go to some people, and they might be the ones who needed it the most. So there needs to be a very, very good level of coordination coordination. And for that, as I said, this is a very, very the task that we are trying to deal with here is massive, because you need to have excellent coordination. You need to understand who might be vulnerable. So you need the community leaders, you need high level of networking to understand and identify who might need help and who. And for that you will have a ground level assessment, so that would be part of your risk or sort of assessment prior. And then of course you need a trained group of people going in and looking, listening, linking, so that people who need help get that help, because these vulnerable communities might not pop up so easily, and you might see them much later, because they have not been attended to. With regard to the second question, for dealing with situations or dealing with crises or reactions that people encounter, there might be a range of coping strategies that might work. We've talked about, I did mention about the narrative, sharing your narrative, so that this is reintegrated into your life, or your life story might be one thing. It could be very creative strategies. I mean, it could be even therapeutic modalities that you go into to give that support. But as I mentioned in my presentation earlier, often people don't need to go to that level. It's sometimes just the human contact that they need, and it is reestablishing their safety, security. If your safety and security is compromised, you are never going to feel okay. Once that is established, you will start rebuilding and getting back to your levels of your prior functioning. So really it depends on what might assessing what might work for different individuals.
Right. I think this next question is a very timely one. So this relates to a behavior many of us have observed during recent disasters and then often find difficult to understand. So we have been repeatedly instructed, even way before tsunami, whenever a disaster occurs. So the bystanders. So people who go to watch. So the question is, a participant wants to know, how do you explain the behavior of people who went to watch the damage during the Ditwa, even when their safety was at risk? How to address it?
Well, it could be one thing, wanting to be involved in humanitarian efforts. It could be. It could be just merely curiosity, but it could be that your personal safety, the need to go and help others overrides that sense of this can be very dangerous to me. And as a collective society, you know that if there's a breakdown of a vehicle, what happens? Lots of people get down and they are trying to help. You might not see that somewhere else. So we are a very collective society. We get involved in other people's business. That's something that our communities are like, but it can be extremely harmful. So people don't process what could happen. Even with the tsunami, we saw that people approached uh, the receding sea line instead of running away. That could be a lack of education. As I said, the perceived threat might not be great. It could be so many things. I will be okay. The optimism bias. So lots of factors, but understanding how to respond to these situations can be helpful. Of course, we don't know what could occur. Unfortunately, tsunami it's after the tsunami that we learned how to respond. Even if, I mean, it's not a disaster, but even COVID, it is only after COVID we learn to respond to COVID. So, but generally, general templates can be formed as to how you deal with these threatening situations.
Right. So we have so many questions. Dr. Amarasuriya, but thinking of the time constraints. So I would like to conclude this, your presentation, and I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Santhushi, for this insightful and grounding presentation and helping all of us to better understand psychological dimensions of disaster experience. Because myself, also as a psychologist, this is something really new, because disaster experiences or disasters is something that it's an area that I have also not really touched upon. So I learned so much from you personally. So I hope all our participants learn so much from you. So thank you so much for this disaster experiences, building on this perspective, for that insightful presentation. Thank you so much. So I now would like to invite Dr. Jeevani Herath to share your insights on well-being, community recovery, and pathway towards healing. So, Dr. Jeevani, so now as we shift our focus now to building long-term resilience and healing within our educational and social fabric, I'm delighted to call you our second speaker, Dr. Jeevani Herath. So your work on holistic education and well-being is precisely what we need to explore next. So the floor is all yours for the next 40 minutes.
Thank you, Ishani. Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. So let me start my presentation and the discussion. Give me a second to share. Okay, so as Ishani mentioned, I will be discussing about how schools can be a hub to support the community in overcoming the psychological trauma, stress that had happened through climate disasters. So I will be talking on that. I think Dr. Santhushi gave me a good grounding for that, talking about what happens at each individual level, and also how the communities can help, and also how humanitarian work can help to speed up the recovery process. So as an educationist, I am more interested on what schools can do. So I will ground my talk on based on schools. So looking at climate vulnerability of Sri Lankan children, I have a map here which shows that the most vulnerable areas for climate disasters. And in these areas, children are more vulnerable to get affected by climate calamities. So when we talk about Sri Lanka is a country that has high exposure to climate threats, such as rising sea levels and floods and landslides, and also drought and heat waves. Now, if you look at the map here, the red colors are the areas where there's a high risk for climate calamities or climate disasters. For example, these red color areas will have flooding and landslides as well, and also droughts and heat waves. The orange color areas in the country are mid-level vulnerable areas. In those areas, mainly there will be droughts and heat waves and flooding and landslides. The areas where which are indicated by the red color, and the yellow color areas have a low risk, but still we saw during the past experience that we had with Ditwa that these areas also had floods and landslides. So all in all, if we look at the map of Sri Lanka, you can see that many parts of the country are affected by climate disasters, climate calamities. So the children of this areas are at a high risk of being displaced and also being affected by climate disasters. Now, looking at this in a global and a regional perspective, we can see that in Sri Lanka, there's around 4.6% of children who are displaced by climate disasters. So it's actually a kind of higher, in Sri Lanka, we have a higher child displacement due to climate disasters. And also we have temperatures, as Dr. Santhushi very correctly said, that the temperature, the fast rising temperatures we have in Sri Lanka, we are, it's like we are afraid to send our children to outside to be exposed by the sun because it's kind of have become a health hazard. So in Sri Lanka, therefore, we have these climate disasters, and also around 5% to the children are displaced by climate disasters. On top of that, in Sri Lanka, when we look at the data, we can see that 16% of under 5-year-olds are stunted, and also 40% of adolescents have mental health issues. Now, when we compare this with at the global level, Sri Lanka is faced with higher malnutrition rates and also above average youth anxiety. And now, when we have this kind of population in a country, on top of displacement, the schools have to rectify or help students in order to, despite their physical and mental disabilities. So talking about physical and mental disabilities, these are some of the data that I have. So children who are under 5, 17% of children who are under 5 are underweight, and they have chronic nutrition deficit early in life, which will impact later schooling. So they will either not enroll at the correct time to schools, or they will drop out from schools, or they will be absent from schools. And also stunting, as I said, 10% of children who are under the age of 5 years are stunted, and this will have a long-term growth impact related to food security. And 21% of adolescents are underweight. So the Student Health Survey suggests nutrition challenges will continue. Again, 60% of got into national headlines, which we saw about a few months back. They cited high stress prevalence, that is stress and depression in students. So in Sri Lanka, around 60% of students are either stressed up or in depression. And again, 18 to 26% of adolescents have depressing symptoms, and older teenagers are particularly affected. So we have a high number of suicide rates for teenagers in Sri Lanka, which is a very sad situation in Sri Lanka. And also 22% of students have reported loneliness, which is an indicator related to mental health. So when we look at these things, we can see that these physical and mental disabilities affect how they cope up with these disasters, climate calamities, climate disasters. So they will be find it difficult to cope up with these add-on disasters into their lives. And so climate disrupted schooling by major events such as Dita or tsunami. So we could see around 4 million children experience closure in major floods. So this is the current situation in Sri Lanka. So the school system in the country is bombarded with these kind of problems in the school system, and also when there are some these kind of climate disasters, it will add up to the level of pressure that the school has to cope up with. Okay, so talking about resilience, we can say that Sri Lankan children are resilient in access to education. 98% of school-age children enroll to primary education. So Sri Lanka is actually, we can be proud of the Sri Lankan education enrollment because only 2% of the population, school-going population, are not enrolled into primary schools. So we have a high number of enrollment in Sri Lanka, which is similar to the enrollment rates of the developed countries. And survival rate also very high, is 93%. Actually, 7% is a high number for school dropouts, but comparatively, we are at a better end because our enrollment rate is also high and retention rate also high. So enrollment and survival-wise, Sri Lanka is resilient, but their resilience is increasingly tested by nutrition gaps, like I showed you earlier by the data, and also mental health stress. We saw that around 60% of students are under mental stress, so they may have depression or they may have depressive symptoms. And also on top of that, as I said, the climate-related disruptions. So this is the current scenario of Sri Lanka. So let us look at where is the problem and what can the schools do. Now, looking at the curriculum of state education in Sri Lanka, from primary grades to A-level grades, we can see that in the curriculum, the knowledge is actually integrated to the curriculum. We have actually a very enriched curriculum where the talk about where it gives the knowledge about the climate changes and how to about prevention, about the societal role, everything is there in the curriculum. So just having a look at the primary grades from grades 1 to 5, the subjects like environmental related activities, religion, and languages. Through these subjects, they teach about basic sciences and environment, nature appreciation, social values and cooperation, simple stories and activities. Like in religion, there are Jataka stories, so small anecdotes of where they talk about stories about resilience, stories about not harming the flora and fauna. So all those things are there in the curriculum, even at primary level. So this curriculum, the curricula will build, it builds awareness and foundational resilience skills. So grade 1 to 5, when a student completes the 5th grade, they will be around 10 years of age. By 10 years of age, the curriculum is designed in a way to build awareness and foundational resilience skills of these children. Moving up to a junior secondary level, that is from grade 6 to 9, the subjects like geography, history, then science, aesthetics and languages, all those subjects have themes like this climate, weather and environmental science, disaster awareness about floods, landslides, droughts, and sustainable practices, water, energy saving or waste management, and also community and social responsibility. In civic education, they talk about community and social responsibility, which will develop their critical thinking, emotional resilience, and local adaptation awareness. So moving from awareness and foundational resilience skills, the children are given content to build critical thinking, emotional resilience, local adaptation awareness. And then moving on to senior secondary, grades 10, 11, the O-level classes, again, they have the same syllabus, the subjects, where there are themes on climate change and greenhouse gases, sustainable resource use and biodiversity, natural hazards and disaster mitigation strategies, practical applications in daily lives, and these will build scientific reasoning, problem solving, and action competence. So you can see how the development of these students' level, how the level of students is developed from primary to O-level levels. They start with foundational resilience skills, but then by the end of the O-level classes, by around age 16, they will build scientific reasoning, problem solving, and action competence. And when they reach advanced level also, there are many subjects that will talk about the environment and the societal responsibilities. For example, advanced climate science and environmental management, climate risk reduction and adaptation strategies, leadership, decision-making, and sustainable development projects. So by the time the student leaves the school at the age of 19 years, they will be having they will build strategic resilience, leadership, and systematic thinking. So what was started as a foundational resilience skill will end up building in themselves strategic resilience, leadership, and systematic thinking. So this is kind of a synopsis that I discussed with you regarding the school curriculum that we have in government schools in Sri Lanka. So we can say the problem is not in the subject content. So we have a very enriched subject content where we talk about all the resilience and stress relieving strategies and community engagement. So we have all those things. But then where is the problem? Why, as Dr. Santhushi mentioned, so why do people just don't mind about danger, just go and look at things? Just when a disaster happens, they just go to as sightseeing. Why does this happen? So that is because the real problem is in teaching and assessing. So the teachers are not trained enough to teach in a way that will make a student apply what is learned in theory. So let us look what is happening. So I have 4 dimensions here. One thing is climate-focused teacher training. So that is one global dimension where the countries will be training teachers, mainly focusing on these climate disasters and whatever the disasters, man-made or natural disasters. So in Sri Lanka, we have actually short-term ad hoc training for teachers. So what happens in Sri Lanka is when something happens, we train the teachers in an ad hoc manner, and we give them some kind of maybe a 1 week or 2 week training on how to manage students in a classroom when something like a nationwide disaster happens. So these are short-term, ad hoc, and these trainings are given when the teacher themselves the teachers themselves are experienced the outcomes, the negative outcomes of a disaster. So it's actually is very a short-term thing, will not be sustainable enough to make it as a long-term plan. But when looking at global best practices, there are continuous pre-service and in-service programs. They are widely available. So in pre-service and in-service programs are really important, and they should be not short term and ad hoc, but they should be continuous. So we had trainings to teachers after tsunami or after Nidpa, but it should not be so. There should be, we have to be prepared for calamities. So there should be continuous pre-service and in-service programs. That is the global level best practices that we can find elsewhere in the world. And the another dimension is resilience, pedagogy, integration. Now we actually in the curriculum, we have this kind of knowledge in the curriculum. The themes, they have addressed all these aspects of environmental changes and how to cope with those tragic tragedies when those happens. But how the teacher teaches the content depends on individual teachers, and what do they do in schools are also dependent on administrators, school administrators. So if a teacher is trained enough to teach the affective and psychomotor skills, then the children will learn of applying what is taught to them. Now, in education, we talk about developing the cognitive domain, psychomotor domain, and affective domain of each student. So, cognitive domain is the knowledge part. So, knowledge part is in the textbooks. So, teachers can deliver the lessons according to the textbooks, then that will improve, that will impart the knowledge. But the affective and the psychomotor domain, now the student can just read the textbook and get the knowledge. But the affective domain, which is developing the emotional intelligence, ethics, morals, and then all those value systems, positive thinking, that is the affective domain. There should be a teacher to guide the students to think in a particular way. And the psychomotor domain, having the skills, when something happens, what can I do? So that is a skill that should be developed through a teacher. So if a teacher is not trained in to do those things, so then the student will not be resilient in disaster. If you look at the global best practices, we can see in the world they are action-oriented, embedded in curriculum and pedagogy, and action-oriented activities which are embedded in curriculum and pedagogy. So just having notes in a book will not help the students, but the psychomotor and affective domain skills, developing those skills will do the trick. And the third dimension is the support structures for teachers. Now, support structures in Sri Lanka, what happens is peer mentoring, which is actually good. So a colleague will observe lessons and then give some positive feedback and constructive criticisms. And there are principals who should go and mentor teachers, and also at zonal level, there are officers who will go to schools and then they will mentor the teachers. So this is there in Sri Lanka, but it is not enough. For nationwide calamities like that, these like what we experience, for example, like tsunami or Ditwa, we have to have strategic support units. And we should have climate resource materials where they should be abundantly available so that the teachers can read and then understand and then be creative enough to teach them in the classrooms. So that is what is seen in some of the countries in the world. And assessment for resilience. And so this is kind of a disaster that we have in the Sri Lankan system. We have largely traditional exam-oriented system in education. So the teachers are compelled to teach students to pass an examination. So from kindergarten to up to up to A level, the students will be drilled onto passing an examination. So they will just rote learn the knowledge, but when something happens, they don't know what to do. So that is why people take risks and just go sightseeing when some calamity happens. So, but what is the best practice global-wide? There should be formative assessments, project-based assessments, so that the resilience learning assessment. So these will help the students to kind of ingrain the knowledge, and they will know what to do and how to do things when a calamity happens. Okay, so then my topic was on trauma, stress, and community responsibility. So as I said, in Sri Lanka, we saw in the curriculum, the knowledge is there. So that is the cognitive domain is in the syllabus is enriched with knowledge. So we can't find anything missing in the syllabus from grade 1 to grade 12. But as I said, the teacher training, the teachers should teach the students to improve their affective domain and psychomotor domain. So schools do not only restore learning after trauma, they have to rebuild emotional balance, behavior, and social responsibility. So in order to do that, affective domain and psychomotor domain should be improved. So as I said, affective domain is regarding the emotions that we have, or our value systems, our morals, our ethics. So that's the affective domain. So through affective domain, we should improve healing emotions. So what are healing emotions? Generosity, altruism, empathy, and care for others. These will reduce fear and isolation and builds belonging and social trust. So generosity is very important. Now, when something happens to us, what happens is Dr. Santhushi very nicely shared a slide with the natural kind of mental things, the emotions that we have. So we tend to be angry, we tend to be sad, we tend to be very kind of rebellious. When something happens, we tend to withdraw from ourselves. So that is the natural thing. That's the natural way. But now we have to come out of that kind of this natural happening, and we have to reduce the time where we wallow on our own troubles. So generosity helps a person to come out of those very quickly. So for example, in a school where there are children who are affected by the disasters, as Dr. Santhushi says, the first hand or onlookers or second hand affected people, they can actually go to houses of children or those who are affected and help them, maybe by cleaning the house, maybe cooking some food, just talking with them. So that is generosity. It's not always about giving physical resources, giving your time, giving your care. That is the generosity. And also altruism. You forget about your worries. You just go and help others. What happens is, then you see, okay, I went through this problem, and there are people, other people also, who are going through the same kind of problems that we have. So like the saying, "Mage karume tamai," saying things like that will stop. You see, okay, people get affected by these things, and this is how people are recovering from those calamities, and this is how people become resilient. So when you go and meet others and be generous towards others, you will see that it's actually you are healing through those things by trying to help others. So by improving the affective domain, children learn to respond to stress by caring for others. And look, the psychomotor domain, restoring stability. So psychomotor domain, as I said, is improving the skills. So that can be done through discipline, structured daily practices, and cooperative tasks. This will re-establish predictability and also strengthen self-control and confidence. So when you have purposeful actions like this when you talk about discipline, the teacher can give a task for students and give a time limit, a deadline for them to complete the task. So no matter what happens, no matter in what mental stage you are motivated to do the task on time. So then the child can forget about the problems that they have, because there's a task to do and there's a deadline. So these structured daily practices, okay, today you have to do this. So maybe it's just telling the students, today is your turn to go to the office and bring the register. You have to do that. So those children who are withdrawn because of trauma, they have no kind of excuse, but they have to go. But if the child says, no, I can't do that, that is all right. So the teacher can say, okay, not today, maybe tomorrow, then you do it. Somehow the teacher has to, in a very compassionate manner, not like as a punitive assignment, but in a compassionate manner, the teacher should give them structured daily practices and cooperative tasks. So rather than having competitions in the classroom, so what teachers tend to say is, I will give a clap to the person who does the task, completes the task quicker, I will give them a clap. So that is building up competition. Rather, the teachers can say, okay, I will give a reward to you if the whole class finishes the task on time. So the children who have done the task before time, they can go and quickly help the other students to do the task. And as a whole class, they complete the task on time. So by these things, the teachers can actually re-establish the resilience of students, and uh, the students will come out of their fear and the kind of helplessness they feel inside. So by improving affective domain and psychomotor domain, the school can actually make the students resilient and responsible learner. So in order to do this, we can have integrated practice, which I call as mind-body balance. So we have to have an integrated practice through tasks like meditation, mindful breathing, or quiet reflection. So meditation, we tend to think that you have to sit at one place for a longer time. No, a teacher, when she starts a lesson, can ask the students for 1 minute. Teacher, together with the student, can just be quiet and just look at their bodies. By closing the eyes, the teacher and the students can feel the body sensations. Where do I feel tight? Where do I feel light in the body? Do I feel uh, some kind of warmth in the body, or do I feel cold? Where do I feel the warmness, or where do I feel the cold? So likewise, when the mind is brought to the body sensations, the body calms down. So only 1 minute is enough at the beginning of the lesson and at the end of the lesson. If a teacher does this, actually, then the teacher can uh, balance uh, the mind and body of the teacher as well as the students, which will in a way help the teaching learning process as well. And mindful breathing. So just 1 minute is enough to look at your breath. If a child can't feel the breath in the nose, the child can just feel the um, stomach, and then can see how the stomach moves with every breathing, in breath and out breath. And also quiet reflection. These things you can do. You can ask the students to take 1 minute after each lesson to reflect on what good things that I did in my lesson. The teacher also can reflect, and the students can also reflect. The student can, the teachers can motivate the students to think only the positive things. Okay, I helped my um, uh, friend in doing the task. Oh, I didn't disturb my friend when he's doing the task. Oh, I didn't disturb the teacher. Oh, I did my work very neatly on the book. So these are all positive things that a person can reflect upon. So these regular emotions improve attention and calmness. So these are very easy things to do. It takes only 1 minute. If if we have this integrated practice, it will connect emotional awareness with bodily regulation. So as a final, to wrap up this, I can say resilience grows when schools and communities jointly nurture values, habits, and inner balance, especially in times of trauma and stress. So if the schools are work together with the families of students, so that is the community. So there are this positive relationship between the school and the community will inculcate values, good values in students, and which will actually help the students coping up with trauma and stress. With that, I will end my session. Thank you very much for listening. If you have questions, you can ask.
Thank you so much, Dr. Herath, for that inspiring and deeply practical presentation. So I think you have spoken, uh, about tangible ways to nurture resilience from and classroom outward. So, Dr. Herath, I would like to ask from you. So, towards the latter part of the session, I was very keenly listening to it. You beautifully explained how to improve affective and psychomotor domains, and also nurturing resilience and well being in children. So, my question is how can we as a community or schools ensure that these practices have a long term impact rather than being short term responses only during the times of crisis?
Yes, thank you for that question. A good question. The sustainability of it. So, actually, what teachers are trained to do is from grade 1 to grade 12, when teaching, they should have they should teach for the three domains, not only cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains. So when you look at the curriculum, the curriculum is starting from grade 1 to O-level classes. Grade 1 will be the foundation, and at O-level, it will be kind of a holistic thing that curriculum we have. So if teachers teach the affective domain and psychomotor domain from grade 1, it will be a development from uh, the skills from grade 1 to grade 10. So it could be sustainable. So to do that, actually, the teachers have to train properly. So as I said, that is what is lacking in Sri Lanka. We have to have a kind of a holistic teacher training where they understand what is taught in grade 1, and grade 10 teachers should understand when I teach for O-level students, what is the foundation regarding this affective domain that they have in grade 1.
Right. I think that very well explained, Doctor. So also we have a question um, about teachers, not really about the learners. So the question is, so how can we empower teachers who also may be coping with their own personal stresses? So as
Yes.
human beings, right? So the teachers must be overwhelmed with their own stresses and their own personal issues. So to become a facilitators of emotional safety and psychological first aid in the classroom, so how can we empower teachers to work on this, Doctor?
Yes, actually, that's a very kind of good concern, as well as a challenge that we have with teachers in Sri Lanka. There's a term that is called um, the teacher burnout. So the teacher burnout is actually the teachers are overwhelmed with the workload as well as the situation in the school settings. So because of teacher burnout, we can see those who are burnt out is a high number in Sri Lanka. It's around 40% of teachers in Sri Lanka are burnt out teachers, where they actually can't cope up with the emotional baggage that they have. So when they have these type of calamities, climate disasters, they will be more overwhelmed, and they will kind of become helpless in the school setting. So what we one thing that they can do is, as I said, they can have mindful activities. So kind of maybe meditation, maybe some kind of other sports activities, or yoga, or any aesthetic, dancing, music, or whatever the stress reduction strategies they have to use in order to help the others. So without helping yourself, they will not be able to help the students. So the first thing that the teacher should do is to recover from the stresses that they have by using those strategies. So rather than like when something happened to us, maybe we try to forget that by watching a film or listening to some music. Rather than that, being actively doing something, as I said, sports or singing or whatever, the meditation, that will help them to kind of heal themselves first. then they can be more helpful to students in their classes.
Right, Doctor. So my next and my final question to you. So I think
Yes.
throughout the presentation, Doctor, you beautifully laid this out. You explained how the curriculum is laid out for our students, especially the national curriculum, the social sciences, and how for each grade how we escalate the learning for students. But since we have the questions, I think let's give a very brief answer. So the question is, how can social science education help students process climate-induced trauma and become agents of empathetic recovery in their communities?
Yeah, once again, as I said, so the curriculum is enriched with knowledge. Now, students actually they don't have to be solely dependent on the curriculum. They have other resources. The social media is there where they can get the knowledge. But the problem, as I said, is the teachers. They should motivate the students to think in a positive manner. That is what is lacking there, because otherwise we tend to think, okay, I can't do anything, I am helpless. That is, as I said, as Buddhists, we talk about karma, this is my karma, and like sort of very negative things will not help them in order to come out of this tragic and traumatic situation. So is, as I said, the affective domain should be improved through generosity and through altruism, through cooperative work, where you feel that you can do something for another person. That will, even though, as I said, even though we tend to go and help the others, it actually what happens is we are helping ourselves. So those kind of things should be encouraged in the school system with the students, so that they will be able to heal themselves actually by trying to help others. So altruism is a very positive thing that we can have in order to heal ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, Doctor, because certain concepts like altruism and then empathy are not really concepts that we teach. We can teach people just using textbooks. I think, as a society, as a community, the educators, facilitators, I think even parents, I think as a community society, we should role model. So I hope that you will agree with me. There's a lot students will learn from teachers, educators, facilitators, parents by role modeling rather than just reading out the definitions from a textbook.
Yes.
Right. So thank you so much, Dr. Jeevani Herath, once again for your
Thank
inspiring and deeply practical presentation. So now also I would like to again thank you, Dr. Jeevani, Dr. Santhushi, both of you for these thoughtful responses, and thank you all to our participants for the very meaningful questions. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we're not able to address all your questions today, but your engagement is truly appreciated. So as we come to the close of this session, I would once again like to sincerely thank our distinguished speakers, Dr. Santhushi Amarasuriya and Dr. Jeevani Herath, for sharing their expertise, reflections, and deeply human insights with us this evening. So I think today's discussion reminded us that while climate-related disasters are often described in numbers, maps, and timelines, the true impact is carried within people, families, and communities. So healing after the storm is not only about rebuilding infrastructure, but also about restoring dignity, emotional safety, connection, and more importantly, hope. So as of the moderator of this webinar, I would also like to extend my gratitude to Sri Lanka Technological Campus, SLTC Research City, and IEPSL for jointly organizing this webinar series. We hope, I personally hope, we hope together this session has encouraged you to reflect, engage and think differently about recovery. At the same time, I have a small notice for all of you. So now our hosts, they have shared a link for the evaluation form. So kindly take a minute. Feel free to say, feel free to express what you feel about the webinar. So that will be greatly appreciated. All right. So on that note, I would like to wish all of you a very pleasant evening, and I will now hand over the session back to Mayangana for closing remarks. Mayangana, back to
Thank
you.
you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Ishani Kariyawasam, for that. And also, I would once again like to thank Dr. Santhushi Amarasuriya and Dr. Jeevani Herath as well for that engaging discussion. And I believe that at a time that we are constantly challenged by all these natural disasters, today's session opened all of our eyes to take, proactive measures and also reactive measures in uplifting all the livelihoods of all the parties that are to be affected by these natural disasters. So once again, thank you very much for the keynote speakers today, and also for the moderator, Ms. Ishani Kariyawasam, for driving that meaningful conversation. So as we have now come to the end of today's webinar, I would once again like to request all of you, as Ms. Ishani correctly said, to fill the feedback form correctly with all your details and your name as well, because the e-certificates will be delivered to you during the next week, and we are hoping to stay connected with you in the next series of webinars that are going to happen as well. So tomorrow we will be having the second webinar of the series, which is Rebuilding the Economy, Short-Term Relief and Long-Term Resilience After a Disaster, which is conducted by Mr. Dhananath Fernando, who is the CEO of Advocata Institute, and Dr. W.A. Vijayawardena, the former Deputy Governor of Central Bank. And tomorrow's webinar will be moderated by Mr. Manjula De Silva, who is the former Secretary General and the CEO of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. So with that, we can now conclude the session. And also I would like to pass a very warm thank you to the National Science Foundation of Sri Lanka, and also the Association of Commonwealth Universities and the National Research Council for their constant support extended in enabling a wider outreach by sharing the information regarding the national webinar series that is planned by Sri Lanka Technology Campus. So on behalf of the entire organizing committee of SLTC, I would like to thank all the participants, the keynote speakers, and the moderator for joining the session. And I wish to see you in the next few webinars as well. Thank you very much and have a good night.